We're talking about the effects of bullying on children, and this is part 2. In part 1, we examine the links between bullying and mental health, and we examine the temporal sequence. So we examine whether children become ill as a consequence of being bullied or the reverse, and we concluded that children, for the most part, become unwell because they're treated poorly by, by other children. Now I'm going to explain the heterogeneity in mental health outcomes. Why is it that some children fare better or worse than others? So when we look at divergent pathways in terms of poor outcomes versus better outcomes, we tend to look at things called moderators. So what would explain these relationships? So what's going to attenuate the relationship or exacerbate the relationship? So several studies have looked at environmental characteristics to explain why some kids fare better than others. So for example, if youth come from better homes, they fare better when they're bullied than youth who come from poorer home environments. And that makes sense, right? If you're bullied at home and you're bullied at school, we're not going to expect that the outcomes are going to be as good as if you were just bullied at school. The classroom can also be an important context that can moderate outcomes. So for example, in one study they found that if victimization emerged as central, the negative impact of victimization on mental health was greater. So what does that mean? Well, it means that if, for example, if you're the only kid in the class being bullied, studies say that that individual does poorer in terms of their mental health functioning than if many kids in the classroom are being bullied. And it makes sense, because think about the attributions that person's making, right? So if a lot of kids are being bullied, they're probably thinking, well, this person's just a jerk. But if they're the only ones being bullied in the classrooms, they think, it must be me. What is it that I'm doing wrong? What is it about me that is so awful that I'm being picked on? So you can see that context is going to matter. Family context, school context, this is what I mean by moderators. There's also personal characteristics that can moderate the relationships. And one of the biggest moderators is gender. So we see that, for example, in one study, peer victimization at 8 was associated with suicide attempts before age 25 for girls and women, but not for boys and men when you controlled for conduct and depressive symptoms. And that's what a lot of studies seem to suggest, that the effects of bullying are, equally problematic for boys and girls in the immediate aftermath, but over time it seems that boys get on with it and girls don't get on with it. In another study, internalizing problems persisted even after the bullying had stopped. And actually this slide's wrong. It should be, no, that's right. So internalizing problems persisted even after the bullying had stopped for girls, but not for boys. So girls continued to have depression and anxiety, well after the fact that they had been bullied, whereas boys kind of, again, got on with it. I'm particularly interested in biology, so I'm interested in understanding things that you can't see and that we don't measure, and maybe help explain why some kids go left and some kids go right in terms of their mental health profile. And I'm going to give one example of a biological moderator. And some people will see this as controversial, and I actually see it as really important. Understanding heterogeneity legitimizes the plight of children, because I hear far too often from people who say that we don't need to do anything, that the kids who aren't faring well are, in a sense, drama queens. I hear this a lot, right? There's something about them. They're constitutionally weak. They're squeaky. I hear all of these pejorative terms directed at individuals who aren't faring well. And the reason they can say that is because they can think of an individual who has a similar experience who seems to be faring okay. So they're comparing an Ashley to a Heather, and that comparison is going to make it so that they can justify not doing anything. So here I'm going to explain how maybe we're wrong on this. Not maybe, I know we're wrong on this. So if we look at the genetic evidence, and I'm going to give one example. So there was a very famous study that came out in 2003, and it was published in the flagship journal called Science. It was a study by Caspi and colleagues where they looked at the influence of a life stressor, in this case being maltreated by your caregiver in childhood. So the influence of that life stress on depression in later life. So they measured depression at age 26. They measured whether or not the person was abused in childhood. And they looked at this polymorphism of a gene. So they looked specifically at 5-HTT-LPR, so the serotonin transporter gene. Now, the serotonin is a good, transporter gene is a good gene to look at. It's a good gene to look at because serotonin is implicated in the development and maintenance of depression. So if you're depressed, you may see your family physician. He or she may prescribe an SSRI, a serotonin selective reuptake inhibitor, and that supposedly the mechanism there is that it allows more serotonin to be available for your brain. So we would look at it, you know, you look at things that are correlated with depression, and we know it's serotonin. So here we're looking at a polymorphism. And a polymorphism is just that you get 50% of your genes from your mom, 50% of your genes from your dad. So the way that gene can be expressed is going to be related to what you inherited, right? So in this case, you can have a short allele from your mom, or a long allele from your mom, or short allele from your dad, or a long allele. And the combination can be short, 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 long, or long, long. So that's a little complicated, but just all know that this is true of everybody. So in this study, and also I should point out that an allele is just one of two or more forms of a gene. So when you think about, some people have straight hair, some people have curly hair, you know, there would be a polymorphism on the allele for the way your hair is going to be expressed. So in this study, they looked at, again, whether or not the person had been severely maltreated or not maltreated. We'll just make that comparison. And if they had a long 5-HTT LPR, their chances of being depressed were no greater if they had been severely maltreated or not maltreated. But if they had the short risk gene and they were severely maltreated, their chances of being depressed in adulthood were close to 60%. So you see that here, actually I think it was 65%, my apologies. So here what you see is that the person's biology is conferring a risk. This is moderating the relationship between a poor environment, child maltreatment, and the development of depression. I know for a fact that people don't know what their 5-HTT LPR is. There might be a few because they're married to a geneticist or something like that, but for the most part, people don't know this. And so when we're making attributions about why one person became depressed when they were bullied and another didn't, I think we're missing an important part, that biology matters. So does it matter for bullying? Well, I know of to date 5 studies that have looked at the link between 5-HTT LPR as a moderator between depression and peer abuse. And in this study, the one in the slide you're seeing right here is from Benjamin's study. So they looked at concurrent depression rates among girls who were relationally victimized by their peers. And you see that if they had the short gene, this short 5-HTT LPR, their chances of being concurrently depressed were 3 times greater than somebody who had the same abuse history but had a long gene. So if they had a long, they were protected. If they had a short, they were not protected. It exacerbated their risk. So when we talk about, I'll put this back up, sorry. When we talk about why there's heterogeneity, there's a variety of different reasons. There's heterogeneity because of context. You know, so what your family environment looks like, what your classroom environment is like. There's heterogeneity because of personal characteristics, your gender, right? Those sorts of things. Your coping, your ability to cope, all of those things can moderate it. But also what we tend to forget is that we have you know, a biological reality that's attached to whether or not we're going to go left or we're going to go right. And it's not to say that this means, you know, if you have a 5-HTT LPR short and you're bullied, you're definitely going to be depressed. That's not the case. But it does help explain why we have such heterogeneity in outcomes.
I have 2 questions. One around the finding that girls tend to have worse longer-term outcomes. What the literature says about that. Does it have to do with co-rumination with peers, or what maintains that trajectory? And the second is around whether differential susceptibility has been explored for bullying. So what about kids who have some of these polymorphisms? Can they actually do better when they have a good environment, or has that been explored?
So we'll start with the first one, so about gender differences. So the research, I mean, people are just starting to discover that girls and women seem to be more vulnerable. I mean, which is surprising because if you look at across other forms of abuse, you see that they're more vulnerable with intimate partner violence, even controlling for the fact that women are abused more than men, right? So there seems to be this effect. And I think girls are particularly vulnerable because, not to suggest relationships don't mean anything to boys and men, but they're incredibly salient for girls and for women. And if you look at evolutionary psychology in that literature, it suggests that over our history, our life history, our evolutionary history, we needed to get along in order for our offspring to survive. So I personally think that there is an evolutionary component to this, and that's why study after study show that we're more sensitive to threats of social cues of being socially excluded. So not only are we more sensitive to the cues that we're going to be rejected, when we do get rejected, we have a heightened reaction to it. And I think that that puts us at risk. Now, in terms of differential susceptibility, so differential susceptibility is a really important thing to understand. It means that, so here I'm suggesting that having a 5-HTT LPR short is a risk factor. Differential susceptibility will say it may be a risk factor in one context, in the context of being maltreated or the context of being bullied, but in another context, it actually may promote something that's positive. And now those studies are just starting to come out, and I can only think about 3 of them that have looked at it, and it seems to be working. So most studies that are looking at differential susceptibility, and it tends to be looked at in terms of genetics, are showing that so what's a risk factor in one context is a protective factor in another context. And it makes sense from an evolutionary perspective, again, because we need that type of heterogeneity to survive. If not, if everything was the same and we were all susceptible at the same level, then one virus could wipe us all out, right? Or we would be incredibly sensitive to environmental pressures, and that would not be very adaptive. So I think differential susceptibility makes sense when I think about it that way.
So you mentioned classroom environment, and I just want to know if there's any studies or your take really on the impact of the teacher, because that whole social emotional learning, the self-regulation, self-management, where we model to children, and we know with teachers we call them having favorites, etc. I just wanted your take on that, on the adult in the classroom.
So we just did a literature review on the role of teachers in relation to bullying, maintenance, and that sort of thing. And there are very few studies. And part of the reason you can see why. So, it's really hard to get unions saying it's okay to do this kind of research. There's a particular vulnerability to teachers. They're okay if we're studying it, if it's going to show something positive, but they would be worried if we're showing something negative. So most researchers have a very difficult time getting into schools to do studies that involve teachers. But there are a few studies, and the few studies show that a good relationship with your teacher is good for outcomes, especially for kids who are vulnerable, kids who are bullied and the like. Good student-teacher relationships affect academic achievement in a positive way. It affects mental health in a positive way, and that sort of thing. And teachers set the moral tone for their classroom, so they could really protect a kid or they could really make their life miserable. And I've done my fair share of observations of classrooms in my capacity, working with children and that sort of thing. And you come into some classrooms and you can see how they're setting the standard, and it's a good standard. And then you go into others and you can see that the vulnerable kid, in a sense, that teacher has licensed others to treat them poorly, him or her poorly, because he or she doesn't like that individual. So they play a really important role. So, I guess my call to action would be, please let us in. It's the data will be anonymous. We need to figure this out, and how do we make something better if we're not able to study the phenomenon?